welcome to the Choral Conductors Colloquium, Volume 2, Lecture 2. My name is Raul Dominguez, and I will be your host and moderator. Before we begin, please note, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted in the near future on our YouTube channel. There you can find all of our past lectures. The University of Colorado Boulder is offering credit and certificates through their Department of Continuing Education for those who attend all 5 of our lectures. Details on how to apply can be found in your Colloquium e-blasts. Today's lecture will be about 1 hour long, followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button found in your toolbar. Priority will be given to questions about today's topic. Please do not submit questions to the chat room. Thank you to our sponsors, you, our viewers, as well as Dr. Gregory Gentry and the Choral Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. To help keep our resources free and available, please consider a small $10 donation to the Colloquium. The donation link is now in the chat as well. Dr. Gackle's resources for her lecture can be found in your Colloquium e-blasts as well as in the chat using the link that I will post just momentarily, because now it is my sincere privilege to welcome the Director of Choral Activities at Baylor University and the National ACDA President, Dr. Lynne Gackle.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Raul. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here, and I thank the University of Colorado at Boulder for the invitation for me to share with you this afternoon. Just a little word of explanation. We pre-recorded this. Raul was kind enough to do this for me. We pre-recorded on Monday because my father is in hospice and his health is declining very, very fast. I did not know if I would be here today or not. And I wanted to do this so badly. So he was more than gracious to allow me to do this. So it's pre-recorded, and I don't know what it feels like to watch yourself actually speak, but I think I'm going to cringe a bit. But nonetheless, I'm going to be here throughout this session, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Please put them in the chat. We'll do the Q&A at the end. And also my email will be on the last PowerPoint slide, so feel free to reach out to me. Good afternoon. And thank you for offering me the opportunity to share with you some information on one of my favorite topics, and that is female adolescent voice. My interest in these young voices has spanned the last 4 decades. I've had the opportunity to gather information to share both as a conductor and teacher of adolescent students, as well as a clinician and mentor for teachers who are in the trenches working even as we speak with these young people. I'm going to share my screen with you right now. There are some handouts I think that you have access to, and I was going to show you those, but I would just tell you that there are basically 4 that we'll be looking at that will be of benefit to you as we work through this afternoon. The first is entitled Understanding the Adolescent Female Voice, and that's pretty much the workshop agenda for today. There are some supplemental things. One will be phases of change, which as we listen to examples, that will be very beneficial for you, as well as when we discuss the actual ranges as well as lift points. There's another one that will just have the notation on it. And then we'll also have a comparison, which is going to be in the PowerPoint, but I wanted you to have access to it after the PowerPoint was over. And then also a little form that I've used with young voices so that they can sort of find where they are in change and keep that as a record, if you will, so that they can actually see what the changes are during the process. So if I can find, there we go. During the maturational process, adolescent voices do present several important challenges to voice educators and choral directors specifically. Those that work with adolescent singers often approach the teaching and conducting of these middle school, junior high singers with a certain amount of anxiety sometimes, and definitely some uncertainty. I know that I certainly did. This comfort, I think, stems from the fact that often some of us as choral directors, are underprepared for working effectively with the needs of these adolescent voices. And I think that some of that challenge stems from a lack of knowledge concerning vocal development during adolescence, but also a lack of experience with working with adolescent voices prior to going into the field, just having hands-on access to the young voices to work with them and understand them better. Over the past 60 years, considerable study has been devoted to the male adolescent voice and its maturation. Documentation has been published concerning their stages of mutation, characteristics of each stage, methods of voice classification and teaching strategies, as well as the psychological ramifications that have affected or that do affect adolescent boys during this time. Over the years, teachers and vocal pedagogues have really made this a topic of study. Due to the influence of vocal training in boy choirs, the prevalent theory in the 17th and 18th century, and even now in some places in Europe, was that when a young male entered puberty and the voice broke, so to speak, he should stop singing until the voice change ceased. In this country, it's generally agreed that allowing the boy to sing through mutation is accepted, and it is largely a matter of care and expert training on the part of the choir master. Such music educators and conductors as Father William Finn, 1939, wrote a book called The Art of the Choral Conductor. He worked primarily with boy choirs. As a matter of fact, one of the members of his boy choir was somebody by the name of Roger Wagner, and that name you might recognize. Another person was Duncan McKenzie. In 1956, I wrote a book about male changing voice. The alto tenor plan, as he referred to the changing male voice, is really attributed to McKenzie. He really believed that the lower part of the voice would, as the boy matured, the upper register just sort of left, and the voice dropped, so to speak, in a gradual way. Another person was Irwin Cooper. Now, Dr. Cooper worked at FSU, and the term cambiata is associated with him, which in Italian literally means changing. He started the Cambiata Press, which Don Collins actually continued on as one of his students past the 70s and into the 80s and 90s. Dr. Cooper wrote another book that some of us used as a sort of a Bible for working with middle school students, and it was called Teaching Junior High School Music. It was about this thick, and actually it was interesting to read, because in that book there would be information, strategies for working with junior high singers, and quite a bit of information about the boys changing voice. Not a whole lot as far as girls' voices, however. Frederick Swanson was another person that also worked extensively with male changing voice, and that was the reason for that was he worked with the Moline Boy Choir for many, many years and became quite a renowned choir. He and interestingly enough, he and Duncan McKenzie would sort of spar back and forth in some of the old MEJ, or Music Educator Journals. That was the publication of what is now NAFME. But they had various views on how this male voice change occurred, and it's kind of interesting to read some of the thoughts that they both had about this. The research of John Cooksey was probably it's the longest ongoing research in our country. John has since passed, and I had the good fortune to know John quite well and to work with him closely. He actually was a student of Irwin Cooper's, and I think that's the reason that he probably started his interest in male changing voice. In addition, he also created a series of articles that were published in 1977 through 1978, which were published in the Choral Journal, and they're still available. And he sort of summarized all of the research at the time that we knew about the male changing voice. He also conducted a longitudinal study in California, Southern California, in the 1980s. This was a landmark study, actually. It was longitudinal, the first one that was done in this country. This study was actually based on a previous study by Daniel Weiss Weiss in Germany. It was also a longitudinal study, and it was conducted in a residential boys' school. Basically, several stages were noted, and Cooksey based his study on the premises found within Weiss's study. In his study, he identified 5 stages that we're aware of through Dr. Cooksey's work, and that would be the mid-voice 1, mid-voice 2, mid-voice 2A, which was the cambiata stage, if you will, the new baritone, and then the developing baritone stage. That brings us to female singers. And the fact of the matter is that typically girls far outnumber our boy singers in our programs, not just as in children's choirs, but also in middle school, certainly, and in high school. I think it's really interesting as I began to work with this voice through the Miami Girl Choir, those many years ago. As I began to look around for information, I didn't find much information written on girls' voices. Dr. Cooper's book was a huge help to me back in the 70s and early 80s, but even then, it would talk at length about male voice change, but nothing was mentioned about female voice change. As I looked at the 1939 book by Father William Finn, there was one sentence that stuck out to me, and that was this: and the girl's voice also changes, though not as dramatically as that of her brother. End of conversation. And I thought, wow, why is there no information about this? And I guess we sort of take for granted that this information has always existed, but it really hasn't. As a matter of fact, the first workshop, and I'll discuss this with you a little bit further, but the first workshop that I ever did for MENC at the time, NAFME now, there were people in the audience that actually came up to me and said, I didn't even know girls' voices changed. And I thought that at the time that was so strange. Looking back on it now, it really wasn't strange. There was a lot of things about female singers that we really didn't know at the time. And thankfully that has begun to change. I referenced this workshop. It was in 1984, and it was at the National MENC Convention in Chicago. I was conducting at the time the Miami Girl Choir. I had started working with the Miami Boy Choir, and when I first graduated from LSU, this was in the 70s. And when I started working with the girl choir, I was sort of at a loss because those voices didn't sound anything like the Miami Boy Choir. There were 2 different sounds. And so I looked around for information, as I said, and found none. I decided to just continue to work the best I could, listening, keeping an idea in my mind about what good sound would be, healthy sound for young people, working on breath management techniques, and trying to choose literature that was not women's choir literature, but wasn't necessarily children's choir literature, but working toward just beautiful tone. I did so for about 5 or 6 years, and I submitted a tape that tells you how long ago it was, and it was a tape for consideration to sing at this national conference. Surprisingly, I got a letter in the mail that invited us to present a 30-minute concert, followed by, are you ready for this, a 45-minute demonstration regarding female voice change. That was a shock because I was not anticipating that at all. I knew a little bit of information was out there, but as I've already explained, the 2 things that I had found weren't very in-depth. I did know the work of John Cooksey at this time. I had not yet met him. And so I decided to just give him a call, and I did. I called him up and I told him who I was. And I said, I'm supposed to do a workshop, and I really don't know that much. I work with girls' voices, but I know that you've done longitudinal studies with male changing voice, and they want a workshop on female changing voice. And so I would really love for you to give me any information you have or direct me into some literature that I can read, because all I have is basically my own experience right now. And I'll never forget, Dr. Cooksey was very kind. He says, well, young lady, I am actually asked this question quite frequently in my own workshops. And he said, I really have no clue about female voices. And he said, I encourage you to study it. Well, that wasn't exactly the the answer I wanted, but it sort of spurred me on into that direction of seeking more information, and I just began to write down things that I was observing. So it was definitely just empirically, just sort of watching and listening and notating, and I ultimately got to meet John, and we ended up working and doing adolescent voice workshops together through the Voice Care Network out of Minneapolis. And it was really a wonderful time for both of us because we were both learning at the same time, frankly. Um, as we talked and sort of compared notes, so to speak, I said, I've found some symptoms of female voice change. And I had identified these for that workshop. I want you also to know that I sent that workshop, or at least the notes from that workshop, into as an article to the Choral Journal, never ever thinking that it might be actually published, and it was in 1984, and never ever realized that 6 years later it would be found in several textbooks. Now, I'll hasten to say that it was not because it's marvelous research. It's basically just I was interested and I began to note things. I think the reason that it was picked up so quickly and incorporated into methods text was because there was no information at all. And I think that's what research is about. Research is about finding out things that need to be studied, where there's either a scarcity of information or basic information to be built upon. And that was my joy to be on the sort of the bottom floor of that. And so the symptoms of change, and if you have your handout, you can actually write these in if you wish, that I noticed. John surprisingly said, "Wow, those are similar to male voice change." And as a matter of fact, many of them were exactly the same. So we have the decreased and inconsistent range. Um, and that's typical of both male and female changing voice. Both voices have a breathiness or a huskiness of tone, and that's pretty much something that we sort of attribute to middle school sound. Voice breaks we think are more for male voices. However, I've heard lots of girls' voices sort of break or crack too, and it's very embarrassing for them. Um, but it is a very natural thing to happen. There's obvious transition notes or passaggi, um, and the appearance of these passaggi become really apparent in the male voice. Cooksey notes it at mid voice 1 and mid voice 2, and it's the appearance of the falsetto. We also see this with female voices. The first one that I noted is around F to G, above middle C, and then the second one, as the voice continues to go more toward the young adult stage or phase, as I call it, is the one at around D to F at the top of the staff, which approximates the adult female passaggio. Then the next is the lowering of the speaking voice. Now, certainly with male changing voices, that voice certainly becomes a totally different timbre, and we have what's called the octave phenomena. We don't have that in female voices, but definitely there is a lowering of the speaking voice that is apparent, and it's very important to note because I think that for those of us that listen carefully to young singers, finding where the speaking voice is very helpful in knowing where the lower terminal pitches are, where the most usable pitches are. And so just a rule of thumb is that speaking voice, when we find where that is, the lower singing or usable singing pitch is generally a minor third to a major third below that speaking voice. So when I'm auditioning or classifying a young voice, I'll have them speak backwards and count from 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and I sort of hear the pitch, and I start from there. That also gives me a good place to start a little vocalization with them, and helps me just know where their voice sort of lives, if you will. Next is the insecurity of pitch, and that is, I guess, it's most obvious. I know we were singing a Wilkes Madrigal one time. It was written in the key of F, and we were having the worst time keeping it in tune. But you probably maybe have experienced this too. If you raise it a half step, maybe even a whole step, all of a sudden it just locks. And I think that has something to do with those passaggi. It's difficult sometimes for them to sing into the center of pitch, or because that pitch is kind of on that little lift point, if you will. The other is the difficulty in phonation. And that is purely just the difficult ability to have the vocal folds adduct cleanly. Sometimes that's because of edema and water retention, and of course, voice change is a secondary sex characteristic. And so the hormonal changes which occur in the body are huge and definitely affect the tissues and what happens with the vocal folds themselves, thus causing some difficult phonation. Then the noticeable changes in timbre or tone quality. Sometimes the voice, as an unchanged voice, sounds very light, very pure. Going through change, a little bit breathier, sometimes huskier, a little bit more rough, if you will. But those tone quality changes are also very symptomatic of female voice change. And it was interesting to note that Dr. Cooksey found the same things as far as boys' voices were concerned. So this little framework for female voice classification, when I first started this back in the 80s, I actually called them stages. I was highly influenced by Dr. Cooksey's work. It was interesting to me that though with male voices, those stages were pretty audible. And once you could identify it, you could re-identify it in other students pretty easily. I found that with girls' voices, because it's always a treble voice, those phases were not as perceptible sometimes, and certainly that the change was more gradual between those phases. So I dropped the stage and actually added just the use of the word phase. So the first phase is the prepubertal. Age is not a reliable factor. I have put some little guideposts here, roughly ages 8 up to 10. And so we know though that everybody's different. We're also finding that kids are maturing earlier and earlier. We're finding that the adolescent sequence in females, that is breast development or thelarchy, which precedes the onset of menstruation, which is menarche, typically by 2 years, is the same. However, the ages at which these girls enter those two sequences is getting earlier and earlier. And this was noted by Dr. Jay Tanner, who is a renowned specialist in adolescent development. He actually spoke about this in the 1970s. And so the phase 2A is premenarcheal. It's noted by an increased breathiness of tone. Range is typically still the same, but there's definitely a lowering of that speaking fundamental frequency that's obvious. Phase 2B is postmenarcheal, and it's considered the high point, and I guess it would be analogous to the cambiata of the male voice. The symptoms of voice change in this phase are the most obvious, and a lot of times it's breathiness for sure, decreased and inconsistent range, and the appearance of those lift points. That first one that I noted for you earlier, which is around F to G above middle C. You'll actually hear that with a student that you're going to hear in my examples in a moment. Additionally, as the voice moves into phase 3 or the young adult phase, there is a little bit of appearance of vibrato. It's recognizable. It's not always consistent, but it's there. Range begins to extend in this phase 3, the young adult stage. It's a little bit greater clarity of tone and more consistency in the tone. Now, this third phase, it does not mean that the voice is an adult voice. In fact, that the human voice doesn't really mature until the mid-20s. But what it really means is that the high point of change has passed. That real, the rocky stage, so to speak, that phase 2B, which is really difficult because the girls, they can't sing the top notes sometimes, and some days they can, some days they can't. The tone is breathy. The voice cracking is more prevalent here. So it means that third phase is past most of that, and you really do hear some of the adult adult sound coming into the voice, but it certainly doesn't mean that it's totally matured. The other thing that's important to note about that is that the human voice matures throughout the age span. It changes every 7 to 10 years, and I think that's helpful for those of us my age to realize that things that I could do at a younger age are going to be a little bit more difficult, or and sometimes even not I'm not able to do them because the voice is changing. That's not a bad thing. It's simply the way life is, and we change as human beings. And I think part of the whole thing that I want people to understand is that going through this process and understanding the change better allows us to have the students we understand what's happening to them, and to note that it is normal and that there's nothing wrong that during this stage, that this is just simply part of living and growing. um, what's really happening during this stage at this point? Normally in my workshop I'll do a whole section on how the voice works, from the standpoint of it being an actuator, the phonators and the resonators, and likening that to every musical instrument, because this is a wind instrument as well. I'm not going to have the time to do that, but I'll just hit the high points of this as such that hopefully it makes a little sense for those of you that have had vocal pedagogy. You know how the voice works, but what happens during adolescence? With regard to the larynx, upon examination of adolescent male larynx and female larynx, there are differences in growth. The female increases mostly in height of the larynx, while the male, it increases more posterior anterior. Thus, you have the protrusion of the thyroid cartilage, or the Adam's apple, which accommodates the lengthening of the vocal folds themselves. In both of the sexes, we have the lengthening, but it's more pronounced in the male, of course. The vocal folds, which I just mentioned, increase as much as 3 to 4 millimeters in the female voice, but whereas the male voice, the increases is up to 1 centimeter. There's also a thickening in the male voice of the male vocal folds as well. The results in these changes with for the girl's voice, the lower limit falls about a third, the lower pitch level falls about a third, and the upper limit increases ultimately with regard to range. There's also some slight timbral changes. In the boys, we find the octave phenomena, which I've already mentioned, and thus producing drastic timbral changes. In the huskiness and breathiness that we hear, is something that is actually due to a gap, which was actually identified in the late 1800s. It's called the mutational triangle or mutational gap. And that little gap is actually the adduction is not occurring cleanly all the way to the back posterior part of the vocal folds themselves, and it represents a weakness in the intra-arytenoid muscles. Um, that is typically something that occurs with age. That adduction with age, as well as the strengthening through singing, and that's where I think that the vocalises that we use, the voice building exercises, if you will, becomes so important. Also, breath management exercises to work with the clean onset and then carrying through the phrase. But certainly, those are things that we can work with our students at any age, children's voices through our elder singers, and we should work with them. I think, though, that breathiness that we note as so characteristic of the middle school or junior high voice is not something that we should even try to totally eliminate, because it is a process and a facet of growth, and the muscles themselves strengthening through age, and as one would reach that more adult phase. But by the same token, I think that a lot of the breathiness that we hear is really inefficient use of the voice, and that's where the vocal exercises and the voice building exercises come into play, and are so important, and can really change sound for our singers. I don't think we ever want to remove something that's innate and part of the process, but the efficiency can definitely be improved by us as choral directors. Um, During adolescence, also, there's an increased breath capacity. Certainly, our bodies are growing during this time. but that is also is due to the lengthening of the vocal tract itself, as far as the increased circumference of the chest, thus increased lung capacity. The resonating cavities are also changing during adolescence. The larynx tends to descend slightly, thus lengthening the pharyngeal tube. The development in the space of the sinus cavities and facial structures is all result in perceived timbral changes in the voice. And the combination of both increased breath capacity as well as the resonating cavities result in a greater voice power and a change in tone or a richening of sound. Certainly, last but not least, is the hormonal secretions at the onset of puberty result in the growth of pubic hair, facial hair in boys, skeletal growth, as well as breast development or thelarchy, which I've mentioned earlier, as well as the onset of menstruation in girls. Um, Laryngologists, one in particular was Dr. Frederick Brodnitz, suggested that the onset of menarche and the lowering of pitch in female voices was simultaneous. Indeed, there were actually studies done by Robert Duffy in the 1970s where the simultaneous changes of the pre and post menarcheal differences were noted at their 13-year-old girls. They're the same age, but the changes occurred greater for the 13-year-old post menarcheal girl. So the drop in voice in vocal pitch was only with speaking voice, but it was very interesting that it seemed there was a definite connection with the onset of menstruation during this time. We know that children, as I said earlier, are entering puberty earlier than previously noted. Dr. Tanner noted that in the 70s, and that's quite a long ago that we note this, but the onset of menstruation in the 1940s was about 14 years old. By the 1970s and 80s, it was occurring shortly before the 13th birthday, and now it's even later, or earlier, I guess I should say. In fact, the menarcheal age appears to be decreasing about 3 to 4 months per decade. Tanner contended that the sequences of change during adolescence have and continue to remain the same. However, as I said earlier, the age at which children enter those stages is younger and younger. And Dr. Joanne Rutkowski replicated John Cooksey's longitudinal study about 10 years after the fact, and she found indeed that those stages of change held true, but she did find that they were entering, especially mid voice 2, 2A, and the new baritone earlier than what Dr. Cooksey had determined. And so I think that's kind of interesting to note. So when we compare male and female voice change, I'm kind of a visual person, and so I sort of used an analogy here. While the male voice change is obviously is very obvious and is due to the octave phenomena, that's that transformation from the treble male voice to the changed male voice. The changing in the changing of the female treble voice is more subtle. It's apparent, however, nonetheless. I relate them to shades of change, like the changes in the color blue, from light azure of the sky to royal blue to navy blue. The color is still blue, but the shades are definitely different. And so it is with the female voice, I think. It's still a treble voice, but the timbres, those shades, are definitely different from each other. If we had two children about 7 or 8 years old, a boy and a girl, and we stood them behind a screen and all you could see were their little feet and their tennis shoes, if we had them sing, we would be hard pressed to know which was the boy and which was the girl, because basically at that stage, those ages, those voices sound very similar as far as tone and timbre, that type of thing. However, the boy's voice, if we continue to listen to that voice change, it would change from the azure blue to maybe green or a different colors. It's like the colors of the spectrum. Listening to that little girl's voice starts blue and then becomes the medium blue or royal blue, and it's still blue, but it would be more, the timbre becomes richer, darker, toward navy blue. Always the same from the standpoint of being a treble voice, however. So here's just a comparison, and this is a handout that you do have access to, but just to kind of go through it very quickly. With regard to laryngeal growth, as I said, the greatest growth for the female larynx is in height. For the male, it's just the opposite. It's more in width. For the lower terminal pitch, for the male voice, lowers the octave. The top of the upper terminal pitch lowers about a sixth. With female voices, the lower terminal pitch lowers about a third, even a fourth. And ultimately, as they go through change, we find that the range actually increases a little bit on the top. Both voices lack resonance, and there's and we know why, due to that mutational gap in the back of the inner arytenoid muscles. The range, we have the lowering and the decreasing of range of the male voice. The tessitura do decrease and fluctuate a little bit. Likewise, the female voice remains treble, but the tessituras do decrease and fluctuate, but finally increase over time. Register development, just like we have the lift points and the falsetto. In the male voice, we have those points of change for the female voice as well, and the adult passage becomes apparent. Next, we have quality, and with males, it definitely changes dramatically. With females, more in color or weight. Finally, both voices tend to have a certain amount of instability. It's really important to note that when we talk about adolescent voice classification, we're really talking about classification with regard to development. We're not talking about voice parts. It's important to note that when we do listen for development and we find out what stage they're in or what phase they're in, then we have a much better ability to place them on a voice part in which they can be much more successful. And I think that's important, and the whole purpose of why we have voice classification for adolescent singers, to note that. We're going to have an opportunity to listen to some adolescent voices, and I'll ask you, just tell you to get the phase, the phases of female voice change. If you'll have that ready, I think that you can notate each one as you're listening and make your own notes along with that. Here's the lift point and the range little diagram that I have. This also is available to you. I thought that it might take I'd take a moment just to explain this so it was very clear. The unbracketed notes that you see indicate general range. Now that doesn't mean that that's the limit. You know, they can possibly sing above that F right there for that first soprano in that the prepubertal phase, and it means that they might even sing lower than that. But that's a general sort of expanse there. Then the ones that are bracketed are actually the generalized tessitura or comfortable singing range. I've already mentioned to you the rule of thumb. It's very important to find where the speaking pitch is, and then we have a better understanding of where we're going to find a starting place for our vocalization, and to know where the lower terminal pitches are as well. This little diagram that you're looking at right now also shows you those lift points that I had talked about. So you'll see that in the prepubertal phase, there's really no lift point that you'll note. Then in stage 2A or phase 2A, you begin to hear a little bit around F and G, maybe up to B flat, but you definitely hear it in the beginning of 2B for most of the students that I've worked with. Also, and you're going to get to hear one that's kind of in between, you'll hear the passaggio coming into the voice a little bit more at the end of 2B and definitely in the phase 3. And sometimes singing around that note is almost impossible. You know, Cooksey talks about blank spots with male changing voices, especially with the new and developing baritones. Around middle C, those sometimes they have trouble even phonating those notes. I found that the same thing occurs with girls' voices around this upper passaggio. So it's just something to be aware of. So we'll spend a little time listening to some of these examples. The first is phase one, which is the prepubertal phase. The speaking fundamental frequency, that's what that SFF is around a middle C up to maybe D sharp, around above middle C. The quality of this voice is much like the boy's voice at this age. It's clear, it's fluty, very beautiful. It's a children's voice sound. Now, I'm not talking about the belting sound that we sometimes hear children do, but that nice, I call it nice, that's my own opinion, but it's a beautiful tone in my opinion, and it's a very light and fluty. The register breaks or the passaggi are not really obvious here, and there's an agility to the voice that becomes a little tested later on. So for this young voice, I would assign this to the soprano part, soprano 1 or soprano 2, probably to soprano 1, however.
The age of this student is 10.9 years.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay. Go.
So that's a really good example of a nice flute-like quality. We'll listen next to phase 2A, premenarcheal. This is the beginning of mutation. The speaking voice is around B or B flat below middle C. There's an inherent breathy quality in the tone. And there sometimes are the beginnings of register changes at around F up to about A above middle C. Not always, but sometimes. There may be some loss of upper range, and thus the assigned voice part in a treble setting would be soprano or soprano 2 if comfortable, whichever one is the most comfortable for them.
The age of this student is 11.8 years.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I usually use an ah vowel. That's not a vowel that I typically do warm-ups on, but it is a very exposed vowel, and it allows me to hear the voice a little bit more clearly. I think also just listening to her as she went up the scale, you hear a little bit more strain in the sound, though she still had that top note, which was the equivalent of the student that sang right before her. But you hear that breathiness sort of inherent throughout the sound. There's a little bit more volume to this little older voice, but it still has that, you hear the beginnings of change, I think, which is the thing I wanted you to note. The next phase is the one that is probably what I would term the high point of change. The fundamental speaking pitch is approximately A below middle C. And that really, as I said, heralds the high point of mutation. There's typically a huskiness throughout the range, and the register change, or the passaggi, is really notable around F above middle C. The lower notes are produced with great ease, and I'll let you guess which voice part this student sings. Often there is difficulty in phonation. Sometimes voice cracking or breaking occurs, as in boys' voices. And typically, the assigned voice part in a treble scenario would be a second soprano or even a just judiciously chosen alto. I hesitate to put this voice in an alto part all the time because I find that they'll use chest voice only. So let you hear a little bit of this voice, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards.
This student is 13.4 years of age, post-menarcheal.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. Breathe. Focus down.
So obviously, this student does have range still. It might be a little bit difficult to sing first soprano, but she certainly has the ability to sing second soprano, and I think it'd probably be the best place for her to sing. I asked you to guess which part she sang, and you probably could tell she sings alto, and you can hear the confidence and just the muscle that is used in the singing in that register. Again, from a developmental standpoint, I would think that working that voice more in the middle register and extension a little bit on the top as well as into the bottom would be the best way to approach that. Flexibility is the name of the game, I think. I'm going to say this at this point. I think most girls that are in junior high, high school, especially the younger students in high school, the 9th, 10th graders, they're typically sopranos, mezzo sopranos, second sopranos, if you will. God didn't make a lot of altos, and he really didn't do it at 7th and 8th grade. So I think that it's real important not to label students. I am an alto, I am a soprano. Perhaps they can know that they sing soprano, but there might be sopranos that maybe will sing an alto part for you if you need them to do so, and it's comfortable for them to do so and healthy for them to do so. So that's what I wanted to be really sure that you understood that. Going on, phase 2B, this is that combination phase that I wanted you to hear, because people say, well, I don't hear phase 2B. I think I'm hearing phase 2A. And it's really probable that you could hear a little of both, because as I said, this change is very, very gradual in nature. Often because it's on a continuum, students can't be classified succinctly into one phase or another. This example that you're going to hear shows a voice in such a situation. The speaking fundamental frequency is approximately an A flat below middle C. The huskiness and breathiness, however, begins to diminish, and the register transition is a little bit less noticeable, at least the one at F or above middle C is. And now the more apparent one, and the one that is sort of difficult, is that at the top of the staff. Here the vibrato begins to come into the tone a little bit. You'll hear that, and there's a little bit of difficulty phonating above that passaggio. So the assigned voice here, a voice part would be, for me, a second soprano or alto. If this voice is more comfortable and you have music that does not go too high, then I would leave them on soprano. However, if in a treble setting where you have 3 parts or 4 parts, I would say either first alto or like a second soprano part would be most advantageous from a range standpoint.
This student is 14.2 years of age, post-menarcheal.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Breathe.
And she does not even attempt the top note. But you definitely hear more clarity in the sound, hear the little bit of vibrato come into the tone. There's a lot more consistency and a smoothness to the overall sound as well. So, but she's really not in that adult phase yet, a young adult phase yet, but you definitely hear that coming more toward that side than the other, I would say. And finally, phase 3 marks the end of the high point of mutation. It's not the adult voice, but it's the end of the high point of mutation. Though I term this the young adult phase, that does not mean that the voice is reached its adult capacity or its final form. The speaking voice is approximately a G sharp to a B below middle C. The timbre approximates the adult female voice. There's more richness in the quality and the greater consistency within registers. Generally, the range, which heretofore has decreased sometimes, it's kind of like one day I can sing this part, but tomorrow I might not be able to. Now there's a little bit more consistency all the way through. The most obvious register change is that of the adult soprano passaggio. There's greater flexibility and agility in the voice, and again you'll hear the vibrato becomes more present. The assigned voice part of this voice, it really can be any three in a treble choir. It could be soprano 1, it could be soprano 2, it could be alto. I think it depends on what A is most comfortable for that singer, what is healthy. And then as a choral director, I call it painting with sound. So if I have a really warm, rich color as far as the tone, and I need that more in the second soprano sound, then maybe that's where I'll place that student. If it's not too low of an alto part, maybe I could place it for one song in first alto. Or if it doesn't overpower in the soprano 1 section, then soprano 1. And I think that's what becomes fun for me as a choral director, to sort of paint with those voices. It also, I think students, they like that because they are learning that their voice can be utilized in whatever capacity, as long as it's healthy and not hurting at all. But I think it builds musicianship. If they are sopranos, not to just listen to the top line, but to actually listen within the chords. So I think it's a win-win on many fronts all the way through. Let's listen to this voice.
This student is 15.5 years of age.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So that brings us back to criteria for classification. As I've said before, that speaking fundamental frequency is huge. I use it even with my students here at Baylor because it gives me a good starting point for the vocalization, if nothing else. But certainly we do hear that speaking voice lower as the female changing voice matures. And it's incremental, half steps. We're not talking like the male voice, obviously. Also, I think it's important to note that sometimes if you ask a student to count forward, they'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'll never find an average pitch that way. So counting backwards from 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you sort of hear the pitch solidify itself. Sometimes kids will not put it on the breath, put the voice on the breath, and they'll 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. So it's really important, if you find that that happens, to have them speak just a little bit louder, speak over to that corner. We don't want them to scream, but certainly to have them say 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Even in my own voice, I hear that change. I'm sorry for the dings here on my other computer. But I can hear a change as far as where my voice is placed when I am projecting a little bit and doing so with a little bit more breath. So that's really important. The vocal range is the next thing. So if their speaking pitch is at a B flat, I might start at an F above that, and just simply 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 down all the way through the range, noting where the top pitch is produced, upper terminal pitch, if you will, upper usable pitch, because I'm really not going to necessarily have them sing in the stratosphere. You could use a side glide if you wanted to, but I kind of want to know what that usable range is. Likewise, from that pitch down as well, and then notating where that vocal range is. Register development. So you hear me have them sing ah, and have them crescendo, one note throughout the range. And the reason for that is in certain areas it'll be just sort of breathy. Other areas there'll be a lot more clarity to it. That's going to tell me where the color of that voice really is and where those passage points are. So I can have them crescendo, decrescendo. I could start them even on a note, say an A below middle C, and have them go ah, which is what you heard on the recording as well. That'll tell me exactly where the passage points are, the lift points. And then by having them crescendo individual notes, then I can see where they are most comfortable and where the best color for that voice lies. It might be between the G up to the E above middle C and up to the top of the staff. It might be in the middle, between middle C and third space C. Those kind of little techniques help me to hear that and to be able to help them understand these notes are notes that you don't have to sing chest voice. You don't even have to really do a whole lot of mixing. This is a very natural place for you to sing easily. And then, of course, the last is the quality or the timbre of the voice. Typically, I'm talking pure versus breathy tone. I think one of the things that I learned very fast was when working with treble voices that were changing. If I put all of my changing voices in one section and then all of the unchanged in another, it really messes up the homogeneity of the sound and the blend. So I kind of work under the premise that, like magnets, like voices repel and unlike voices attract. So by placing a breathy voice next to a pure sound, next to a breathy voice next to a pure sound, and so forth, within the sections, it's a really unique thing that happens because it actually increases the tone, the volume, the perceived volume at least. They don't have to sing louder, but just the acoustical effect really is nice and creates such a beautiful homogeneous sound. So it's something that I would share with you because it is something, especially with younger voices and developing voices, that really, really does help and works quite well. So let's just talk in summary. Just a few concepts. Number one, age is not a reliable factor. All right, wish it were, but it's not. We can think about ages, around age 10, around age 12. Yes, that helps. But everybody's made uniquely and everybody's different. So we have to just listen and kind of note where they are physiologically, vocally, and that helps us to understand a little bit better. Voice change is gradual. Whether it's male or female, it is gradual. And I think it does occur for guys, it seems, that quickly. I know there have been dissertations written about the voice change in the summer of the 8th grade year. Mitzi Groom did that at FSU years and years ago for her doctoral dissertation. But nonetheless, overall, for female voices, I found that this is a very gradual process. It's important to know that the sequence of change is predictable. That changing process, just like when I talked about with the breast development, the onset of menstruation, usually it's about 2 years from the development, breast development to the onset of menstruation. That is predictable, and that Dr. Tanner says, and we even have Joanne Rutkowski's work as far as what vocally is going on with male voices to tell us that that does not change the sequence. What does change is the time. The earlier and earlier kids seem to be entering into those stages. So that's the thing to note. Classification in this context refers to vocal development, not soprano, alto, tenor, or bass. I think it's so important to listen to individuals for reclassifications frequently. That's the little sheet that I showed you that's in your handouts. It says girls classification sheet. I actually have one for boys too. And kids love to do this because they go, oh, that's my voice. And I show them where it is on the piano, and they notate it, and they keep it in a file portfolio. And we listen maybe at the beginning of the school year. I know you're really busy, but if you can do it in the middle of the year and maybe at the end of the year or per semester, if you can have 6 of those, it's great. But if you only had 3 of them, that's better than nothing. And they really get into it. They kind of like to see what's going on. Classify for vocal development and then place on the voice part. Don't just say, okay, you're all going to sing soprano or alto. Listen to them. It's in that listening that we get to know their voices and help them to know their voices better. Also, I would say avoid labeling. You know, it's always funny to me when I say, okay, what voice part do you sing? Oh, I sing alto. I said, really? You know, and then I said, do you play the piano? And they go, yes. And that's why they sing alto, is because they read music. And that's real helpful and everything. But I don't want them to think that they are an alto, that they are altos. So try to avoid labeling, helping them to understand that most girls at this stage are mezzo-sopranos. And they might be able to sing the alto part, or they might be able to sing second soprano or first soprano. Alternate voice parts. I talked about this with the older singers particularly. I think that's so important to accommodate the ranges and the fluctuations, because during that change process, those ranges do decrease and they sort of fluctuate. And on one day, that's what's so frustrating to some of the young women, is that on one day they could sing the note and the next day they can't. Same thing with guys, frankly. And so helping them understand that, you know what, that's nothing wrong with you. That is the way it is. And that's just going to change. And you know what? I remember I took a 12-year-old to one of the sessions that I did for the Florida Music Educators Association. I always took kids out of my choir to show each one of the stages, similar to what you listen to. But I remember this one little girl was about to drop out of choir because her voice just wasn't doing what it used to do, and she was like the star. She was the soloist for everything at her school, and it kind of bummed her out, and she really thought, well, something's wrong with me. I can't do this anymore. And so she was that 12-year-old voice right in the middle of everything. And yes, her voice broke a little bit, and I kind of encouraged her along. It was interesting, though. At the end of the session, she came up to me and she said, I think I finally get it. I used to sound like so-and-so, Katie, but I realized I'm kind of right in the middle, and one day I'm going to sound like Christy. I said, well, maybe not just like Christy, but yeah, you got the idea. And all of a sudden it was like, okay, I can deal with that. And she decided to sing in the choir, which really made me really happy. At the time, her mother was my board president, so that made me really happy. But it's just a little story to show that, when things happen to us and we have something that's a talent, we think we can do it well, and then all of a sudden we can't, or we feel like we can't. It affects us mentally. It affects us emotionally. And I want music to it has always in my life been that thing that I did that brought me such pleasure. And I did feel like, okay, I might not can be a cheerleader, but I can sing. I might not can sing on the Met stage, but I love to sing. it is good for my soul. And that's what we want for our students. I think that the following concepts are applicable to all adolescent voices, but by being aware of these concepts that we've just talked about, I think we can, number one, help students to understand the uniqueness of their own voices. They can, through the voice building and through consistent, appropriate vocal techniques, we can encourage and facilitate development and good vocal habits that hopefully last a lifetime. And then number three, we can more appropriately select good literature for them. And hopefully at the end of that, they become more successful in their musical experiences. I think that recognizing their own uniqueness is huge. My book is entitled Finding Ophelia's Voice, Opening Ophelia's Heart. And it was based on a best-selling book. That title, The Use of Shakespeare's Ophelia, was based on Mary Pfeiffer's book in the 1990s, Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls. And of course, Shakespeare's character was a tragic character. She tried to be all things to all people, and it was only in her songs that ultimately she lost her mind, but in her songs she was lucid. In her songs she was herself. And I think that in a world that tells young women and young men, but especially young women, you have to be this way, you have to look this way, walk this way, talk this way, before they even understand how unique and special they are. I think it's such a travesty. And so if through our music, we can encourage them to accept themselves, know themselves better, know that this too will pass, there's nothing wrong with them. They're certainly not broken. We give them a gift that helps them to understand themselves better, a gift that hopefully allows them to be able to sing for a lifetime and have music be a part of their lives. For some, maybe they'll major in music, be music teachers. For others, they'll raise their children to love music. And for others, they'll simply sing all of their lives wherever they go. And to me, that's the whole point of what we do when we work with adolescent singers. We work with any singers, but especially this age, because this is the key between the children's chorus and the high school choir and the collegiate choirs. This middle level, this changing voice, with all of its challenges, also brings all of its joys. I have really enjoyed visiting with you this afternoon. I thank Raul for the opportunity, and I hope that you'll throw some questions in the chat, and we'll be able to talk about those. I've recorded this a little bit early. My father is very, very ill and declining, and he's on hospice, and so I talked to Raul, and he graciously allowed me to record early. I hope to be with you on Wednesday, so that I can answer any questions you may have. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Dr. Gackle, for your insight. We really appreciate you being with us here today. And as I adjust my screens to get to the next segment, if you're interested in exploring Dr. Gackle's research further, I am placing a link to her text, Finding Ophelia's Voice, Opening Ophelia's Heart, where you can purchase a copy of her text. This link can also be found in your Colloquium e-blast. So we'll now transition into the question and answer session. Please remember to submit your questions. Please remember to submit your questions using the Q&A button. Priority will be given to questions about today's topics. Looking over the questions, Dr. Gackle, our first question: when voicing 7th and 8th grade girls, I find the range limit becomes more of a determinator for range than color and timbre. And unfortunately, so many range-wise need to sing soprano 2, and they seem to be the weaker singers, so that part suffers. Any suggestions?
I'm assuming you're talking about using SSA literature. And yes, let me preface by saying, I also, when working with this age group, I don't hesitate to use unison pieces. And the reason for that is because it's all about tone building. The other is equal voice music, such as like Sound the Trumpet by Purcell. Those are pieces that are very much balanced from the standpoint of range and tessitura, because you're exactly right. There are a lot of girls that have basically the same the same range elements as each other. So as we work with older girls and beginning high school, we do have more of a variance. But you're right, that's 7th and 8th grade. So that's the reason I don't hesitate to look at unison, as well as I even do unison singing with my collegiate women, because it just really builds skills. You know, some of the most difficult singing to do is unison singing. It builds that skill to listen within the section, and we have to have that. So I would encourage the use of equal voiced music, and when you do have this sort of situation going on where you do use SSA music, you simply just balance it out a little bit, and at least that's been my experience. The other thing is to go back and be sure that when you're placing them, that you do listen to the voices from the standpoint of breathy, and even within the section, breathy and pure, because I have found that really encourages a better overall blend, as well as it sort of makes the tone and sort of amplifies it, quite frankly. But I hear what you're saying. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but if I understood it correctly, that would be my response.
Thank you. Next, have you noticed a relationship to the inability to match pitch when a female's voice is going through their change, or perhaps the hardest part of their change?
I've noted that occasionally. I don't know that it's been any more so because of change necessarily. Sometimes students simply have trouble, pitch matching, and I find that a lot of times that's just they're not used to singing. Sometimes students have not had a lot of experience, and when they have had experience singing, it's only been in one particular register. So I don't know that I've really experienced that as a part of the process, but basically just an issue with specific kids that have had trouble matching pitch, and then we can work with those. Again, to put them in the top soprano part won't always do it, and certainly unison singing and trying to get them into a more comfortable pitch area with a compass that's a little bit not as extended, I think also helps with that. But it's not been something that I found that I associate with voice change, no.
Thank you. Next, how often do you have to navigate the emotions for the student when she identifies as a soprano and the voice is demonstrating much more comfortably and facilitating in the lower voice, i.e. soprano 2 or alto? Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that, because frankly, I find it just the opposite way. When they find that their voices, they don't sing, the high notes don't come, they really identify with the alto sound, and they don't want to sing so high. But then after we work on flexibility with vocalises and things like that, all of a sudden they're singing up higher, and that alto part is the low part for them. So I think typically there will be some students that will hang on to that I'm a soprano type of sound, and the part of this, they like to sing the top because it's a little bit easier. And I'm asking them now to listen internally and follow another part that's not so easily heard. So that's generally the resistance that I get. Not so much that they identify with that part so much, but that it's a little bit harder. It takes a little bit more focus. And but then once they, there's also that alto thing that girls get going. I'm an alto. They kind of get the we're all in this together, and then they don't want to leave that. So it's interesting. I know that sometimes when I'm still going out into public schools, a lot of times the girls don't want to sing the soprano part. They feel like they're exposed there, or it's not, it's just not cool, or whatever. And trying to get them to explore that register is, I think, harder, and a lot of that is just use of the breath, and allowing them to explore the range and utilize the breath capacity that they have, and also just the breath management skills. And I think that's going back to even the first question. So that breathiness that you hear, and it's a weaker sound, if they can take that breath and focus the breath a little bit, with some of the, even consonants with pitch, just using the me, using the M sound to bring the tone forward, and vowel following. I used to use one, ni, ne, na, no, nu, just ni, having the focus with the N and then go to the vowel, and actually going back and forth, audibly making the difference between the voiced consonant and the vowel, understanding that the vowel lines up and is placed where the consonant was. And if they can feel that and carry that into what we call the vowel stream, as it were, I think it really helps to make a lot more consistency of tone, and it's not as weak sounding. It really, because you're managing that breath and focusing to increase resonance, quite frankly.
Thank you. I believe this was touched on during the lecture, but perhaps it can be expanded upon. We have someone who states that should the girls switch from one vocal part to another as their voices are developing during adolescence? Does this happen often?
You know, I typically, I do move them around. But with that said, girls whose voices are really challenging for them at, say, that phase 2B, I'm not going to move them back and forth between soprano 1 and alto. I'm going to try to find something that is theirs, that they feel confident with. But I'm listening to them constantly, and I'm always vocalizing the entire choir in both directions. And I find that they're less resistant to being moved around. I usually do the moving with the older students, but once I listen and I assign, if they're in a particular phase, where soprano 2, you saw in the diagrams that like soprano 2 can be sung by many of those parts, actually, by many of those phases of change, and in so doing, they're going to be comfortable wherever. And then again, if I don't go with an SSA format, which is what I was saying earlier, everybody's singing the unison line. Everybody's doing they can go, if it's equal voice music, they can flip-flop back and forth. I think the resistance that I've had at any time to that has been, I've already learned this part, okay, and I'm not going to have them change because of that. However, if the part becomes, it's difficult for them to sing, I'm going to say, I think we might need to learn the other part. Or I can do what you do with boys' voices, and we can pivot some of those notes too. If that part's too high, okay, let's just take this note here. Or, you can move things around, but I think part of it is just getting them to know where their voice is and what they need to do in order to sing certain pitches. By putting them hopefully in a place where they can sing more efficiently, then they don't have to be moving around passaggi all the time, and it's more comfortable, so they don't have to deal with that. So in answer to your question, yes, I do move them. I don't move them all the time. It's not, I don't want it to be perceived that way, but I think by listening and just being attuned, okay, yes, your voice is changing. Is this first soprano part still comfortable for you? Yeah, you still have that G. We can do it. Remain there. It's okay. If it's not, let's talk about maybe we can move to a different part for this particular piece. And then that, I think, knowing what we have in our choir also, as far as where the vocal demands, well, where the voices are themselves, then we can select literature and know what the vocal demands of that literature are, and we can accommodate the choir a little bit better. Sometimes we select things and then you go, well, I love this piece, but it really, my kids don't do it too well, and there's a reason for that. So it's kind of like buying a new pair of shoes. I love that shoe. Well, I'm a size 8 and that's a 6, so it's probably not going to work. So it's a matter of listening, knowing what you have, and then working from there.
Thank you. We have 2 questions regarding warm-up, so I believe I can try to combine them into a 2-parter here. They are asking for tips or exercises on warm-ups regarding, number 1, negotiating the lifts that we've spoken about, how to negotiate those lifts as the voice matures, and then number 2, building tone.
Yeah. Those are key for all of us. They really are. I think for those lift points, the first and foremost thing I'll say at the outset is I like to work from top down. And that really does help. I think when we start going from the bottom up, that's where those lift points are really most obvious and bothersome, because it'll sort of flip, and that's where we lack consistency. But I think that if we can work top down, that helps a lot. The other thing is, if you are going to do an interval, having them side glide, literally going having them slide forward on a forward vowel. And I think that's the other thing, either a consonant with pitch, such as an M or an N, and then and they sort of go through very forward placement, because what we're really doing is working to get resonance in the tone all the time. And so that by bringing the tone forward, you can use the side glides, working top down. I think those are the most important things. The ni ne na no nu, I do love this one, and it's just simply ni ne na no nu. I want them to feel sort of a spin here, and that's the reason I use a little ooh sound here. Ni, ne, na. And each one of those vowels increases, and the spin increases too. And then the last one is like a little piece of spaghetti. The other thing is to have them note the difference, the placement of an E, and feel the lift. The lift is key for treble voices. If they sing it very bright, usually the soft palate is flat. But if they can get a little bit of lift, and I don't mean drop the larynx, but lifting it just a little bit. And I got this from Charlotte Adams, and it's in that beautiful work, was it Daily Workout for a Beautiful Voice. It revolutionized the way I thought about women's voices at that point, because it took that, it helps them bring the tone forward, but then it helps them just to feel that lift. And of course, the hand just lifting like this, and even as conductors, you know, we'll use a gesture that helps promote that lift as well. And then just I was going to say one more thing, and I can't think of it right now. But I think that bringing tone forward, feeling that lift, is key to just the consistency of sound all the way through. Let's see, something else. I can't think right now, but anyway, hopefully those things help. In the book, I do talk about this quite a bit, and as far as just vocalises, and I think that there's a sequence to vocalization. I don't just start with any old vocalese. I start with some side glides. I start actually with the physical warm up, and then the side glides, and then working with that. Oh, the other one, I did think of it. But when they sing an E, most of them untrained singers will sing he, and so I start with an ooh, especially with younger treble voices, ooh, because it automatically lifts the soft palate. Ooh, and then I bring it into the E. Matter of fact, if I work the ooh and all the other vowels from that. Now, I learned with younger treble singers, if you continue to do that with girls, they'll end up sounding like it'll be a hooty sound, almost like a boy choir sound, that you don't want those girls to sound like a boy choir. But as they get older and they can first find that E, then all the other vowels kind of come off. E, oh, everything stays forward, and even the vowels that are further back or a little darker can also have that resonance in it. And along with the lift, there we allow the voice to have the color that we know as girls. And that's what makes the girls sound, I think, so different from the male treble sound, and certainly from even the older women's sound. There's a flexibility to it, and yet a lightness and purity to it all at the same time. And there is a little breathy quality to it, which is youthful, but it's not like the typical just with no focus whatsoever. So it's by bringing that tone forward and the lift. I think those are the two most important things that I've been able to have some success with young singers with.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to be mindful of our time, so if you didn't have your question answered live today, in a moment in the chat, I will repost Dr. Gackle's email address. There it is right there, along with several of the other links, including the resources that she passed out, the link to finding Ophelia as well. And everyone, oh, yes, Dr. Gackle?
Yeah, somebody had asked about, do you have a male classification form? And I do. And I'm happy if, I don't know who that was, but if they'll email me, I do have it and I can forward that to you. And basically I took Cooksey's work and did very similar types of things and made a little handout, and it works quite well. So I'll be happy to share that too.
Great. And actually, if you copy me on that email, Dr. Gackle, I can also upload it to this Google folder where your
Sure.
resources live, and we can share that with everyone.
Be happy to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you. And that is a wrap. Please, everyone, help me thanking Dr. Gackle for being with us today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone. Have a great summer.
Thank you. If you've enjoyed our content today, please consider a small donation to help us keep our resources free and available. That link is in our chat and on our Facebook page. Thank you again to our sponsors, Dr. Gregory Gentry and the University of Colorado Boulder, and you, our viewers. We will see you in 2 weeks for our third lecturer who was here with us today, Dr. Andre Thomas. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you in 2 weeks for Way Over in Beulah Land, Understanding and Performing the Negro Spiritual. That is June 30, 2 p.m. Mountain Time. We will send all of today's lecture materials in the next Colloquium e-blast. There you can tell us how we're doing by taking our post-lecture survey. Share our content with your friends on Facebook and Instagram at Choral Conductors Colloquium. And finally, I hope you'll use what you learned today to put beauty into our world. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Dr. Gackle. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.